Forest Ranger Jolly Boone Robinson recorded that in September, "We first started the improvements at this station. They consisted of a log barn and a 3-room house cut from green-blue spruce on site. The new U.S. Forest Service had small budgets, long supply lines, and big expectations. Cabins had to stand through deep Rocky Mountain snow, spring floods, and decades of use by fire crews and pack trains." A typical cabin corner meant 60 to 100 saddle notches in round logs, everyone cut with a crosscut, saw that might be the only long saw on the district. A full sharpening meant cleaning, jointing, setting, and filing every tooth and raker, a half-day of skilled work, often by lamplight. Most men hogged each saddle out in one long cut. Some didn't. They scored, relieved, and pared instead, keeping plates cool, teeth sharp, and a spare blade or chain still in its wrapper when the roof went on. The difference shows up a century later in which corners are still tight. The frost came early that autumn of 1909 in the high country of central Idaho. It gathered in thick white lines along the bottom logs of older cabins, marking where chinking had failed and cold air leaked through. At the newer ranger stations scattered across the Nez Perce and Clearwater forests, crews were racing to finish structures before deep snow made work impossible. A standard Forest Service cabin measured 14 to 18 feet wide and 18 to 22 feet long. Round logs, peeled green, stacked 8 to 12 courses high. The arithmetic was simple and unforgiving. 64 to 96 saddle notches per building, everyone requiring careful work with saws and axes that couldn't be replaced until the next freight wagon arrived. The distance from Slate Creek Ranger Station to Whitebird was 10 miles, to Riggins, 18. In good weather, a supply run took most of a day. In winter, it became impossible for weeks at a time. What you brought to the building site in September was what you had until May. Most rangers and homesteaders understood this arithmetic. They planned accordingly, ordering extra nails, spare axe handles, additional files for saw maintenance. But the crosscut saw itself, the long, flexible plate of steel with its precise pattern of cutters and rakers, represented a bottleneck that no amount of planning could fully overcome. Each ranger district typically had one, perhaps two, long crosscut saws suitable for cabin work. Bucking logs to length was one job. Shaping saddle notches was another, more delicate task that asked different things of the steel. And when a saw went dull, when its teeth lost their keen edge and the plate began to bind and heat in the cut, someone had to stop building and start filing. The contrast between cabins was already visible in those early years. Some structures built just 5 or 10 years earlier showed sagging roof lines and corners that had settled unevenly. Door frames, racked out of square. Chinking fell out in chunks. Other cabins, built from the same timber in the same valleys, stood plumb and tight, requiring only routine maintenance. The difference wasn't luck. It wasn't better timber or more favorable sites. When preservation crews decades later would measure and document these buildings, they would find the answer written in the corners themselves, in the specific geometry of how one log sat on another, and in the tool marks that revealed how those notches had been cut. The filing vise sat near a small window in the equipment shed at Alta Ranger Station in Montana, built in 1899. Fine steel dust coated the floorboards beneath it, evidence of hours spent restoring keen edges to dulled teeth. A crosscut saw was a sophisticated tool, far more complex than it appeared. The plate itself, 5.5 to 6 feet long, flexed slightly as it cut. Cutter teeth did the actual work, slicing wood fibers. Raker teeth, set slightly lower, cleared sawdust from the kerf. The entire pattern repeated along the length of the blade, each tooth requiring individual attention during sharpening. The full maintenance cycle, what the Forest Service manuals called dressing the saw, began with cleaning old pitch and dirt from the plate. Next came jointing, running a flat file along the tooth line to bring all cutters to the same height. Then each raker had to be measured and fitted to the correct depth below the cutters. After that, every cutter tooth needed pointing, reshaping its edge to the proper angle. Finally came setting, bending each tooth slightly outward, alternating left and right to create clearance for the plate in the cut. The manuals specified these steps in careful detail because improper sharpening produced what experienced filers called a misery whip, a saw that bound, heated, and exhausted the sawyers without cutting efficiently. A properly sharpened saw, by contrast, pulled itself through the wood with minimal effort, the teeth clearing their own path. For a skilled filer working under good conditions, dressing a 6-foot crosscut took close to an hour. For a ranger new to the task, working by lamplight after a long patrol, it could take much longer. Either way, that hour produced no wall height, no roof coverage, no progress toward a finished building. The arithmetic was stark. If a cabin required 10 full sharpenings to complete, that represented 10 hours, more than a full working day, spent at the vise instead of the building site. In a mountain district where the entire building season might span only June through September, losing even a single day to maintenance could mean the difference between a finished structure and an incomplete one. The expectation among most builders was straightforward. More sawing meant faster progress. Cut deep, cut continuously, and the work would go quickly. But the saw itself imposed limits. Aggressive, full-depth cuts through green wood, especially cuts that twisted and bound in varying grain, generated heat and friction that dulled teeth rapidly. Some rangers, those who had worked in lumber camps or learned filing from demanding supervisors, understood a different approach. They treated the saw as a scarce resource that needed protecting. They made shallow cuts where possible, letting other tools, axes, hatchets, chisels, do work that the saw could do but didn't need to do. The difference showed up in the ledgers, though no one kept explicit records of notches per sharpening. It showed up instead in which buildings got finished before snow, which projects had to be delayed until the next season, and which corners, decades later, would still sit square and tight. The preservation crew arrived at the old homestead cabin in the summer of 1973, part of a survey documenting historic structures in western Montana. Their level showed the problem immediately. The top log course had twisted nearly 2 inches off true, and daylight was visible through the corner joint where logs no longer met. This was a standard saddle-notched cabin from the early 20th century. The notches themselves followed the common pattern. Each log had a curved hollow carved into its underside or topside, allowing it to nest onto the log below. The cheeks, the vertical faces on either side of the hollow, were cut parallel and fitted tight against the log above or below. The theory was simple. A deep, tight saddle would lock the logs together and create a strong corner. The reality, visible in cabin after cabin across the survey area, told a different story. Tight cheeks trapped moisture and encouraged decay. Deep, continuous hollows cut through varying grain patterns created stress concentrations that split the wood. And the method of cutting these notches, typically one long continuous kerf with saw or gouge, produced inconsistent results. Forest Service preservation manuals from later decades would document these patterns systematically. Differential settlement at corners, checks and splits radiating from notch areas, chinking that fell out repeatedly because the underlying joint kept moving, corner logs that required replacement after just 20 or 30 years of service, necessitating the delicate and risky work of jacking up the wall, cutting out the failed piece, and fitting a new log into place. Not all cabins failed this way. The survey crews found structures of similar age, built from the same species of timber, that showed minimal corner problems. When they examined these buildings closely, they found subtle differences in the notch geometry. The bearing surfaces were slightly different, flatter, more defined. The cheeks showed small outward flares instead of parallel contact. Tool marks suggested multiple cutting operations rather than single, continuous gouges. The standard approach treated saddle notching as straightforward. Mark the hollow, cut it out in one. Operation: fit the logs together. But wood is not a uniform material. It has grain patterns, hard and soft zones, areas that compress differently under load. A single, wandering cut through this varying structure asked the saw plate to follow an irregular path through changing resistance. The mechanical result was predictable. The plate twisted and bound. Friction generated heat. Teeth dulled rapidly. The sawyers, already working in awkward positions, often atop a partially built wall, had to force the tool through the cut, increasing the binding and heat in a destructive cycle. When preservation crews measured the tool marks in well-preserved cabins, they found evidence of a different approach. Shallow scoring cuts defined the limits of the notch. Short relief cuts broke the waste into manageable sections. Final paring cuts, often made with axes or hatchets rather than saws, shaped the bearing surfaces and cheeks. The question that emerged from these surveys was straightforward. If builders already understood multi-stage work in other contexts, why were so many saddles still cut in single operations? And what had the builders of the better-preserved cabins understood that produced such different results? The wall under examination dated to the early 20th century, part of a relocated ranger station now preserved for interpretation. Under raking light, the tool marks became clearly visible, parallel vertical scores running down the face of each log, then the broader, flatter marks of broadaxe finishing between them. This was the standard North American hewing pattern, documented in Forest Service manuals and carpentry guides across more than a century. The process had 3 distinct phases, each with its own purpose and tool. First came scoring. Using a felling axe, the worker made vertical cuts down to a marked depth line, spacing them a few inches apart along the length of the log. These scores didn't remove material. They simply guided where the wood would fail in the next step. Second came roughing off. The scored blocks were knocked or chopped out, leaving a rough surface that approximated the final face but didn't yet meet the marked line precisely. Third came finish hewing. Using a broad axe, a tool with a wide blade and offset handle designed specifically for this work, the worker made long, sweeping cuts that brought the surface to final dimension. The broad axe cut with the grain wherever possible, producing a smooth face that required little additional work. The same 3-phase logic appeared in other joinery contexts. Mortises for beam connections were laid out, with scoring cuts that defined the cavity's edges. The waste between the scores was then chopped out. Finally, the interior was pared smooth with chisels. Tenons were sawn on their face cheeks, then had their shoulders scored and chopped before final fitting. This wasn't random habit. It was efficient use of tools and material properties. Scoring created predetermined failure lines in the wood, allowing controlled removal of waste. Relief cuts, whether knocking out scored blocks or making intermediate kerfs, broke large volumes into manageable pieces. Finishing cuts cleaned surfaces to final dimension without fighting through full-thickness material. The pattern showed up in indigenous timber work as well. Canoe blanks were scored and burned, then scraped smooth. House posts were outlined with controlled cuts before final shaping. Lodge poles were stripped and dressed in stages. The specific tools varied, but the underlying logic remained constant. Guide the split, remove the waste in pieces, finish to final form. European log-building traditions, Scandinavian, German, Polish, all employed similar staged approaches to shaping timber. Complex joints like dovetails required multiple saw cuts to establish geometry before waste removal and final fitting. Even simple lap joints worked better when cut in phases rather than attempted in single operations. The question regarding saddle notches became clearer in this context. If experienced builders routinely used 3-phase sequences for flat faces, mortises, tenons, and other joints, why would they suddenly abandon that logic for the most repeated joint in the entire structure? The most likely answer: they didn't. Some builders, trained in careful joinery and aware of how wood responded to staged cutting, simply applied the same logic to saddles. Others, working faster or without that background, treated notches as rough excavations that could be hogged out in single cuts. The difference in results, visible a century later, in which corners remained sound and which required extensive repair, suggested that the staged approach produced measurably better outcomes, even if no builder at the time wrote down explicit instructions for three-cut saddle notching. The diagram showed a round log approximately 10 to 12 inches in diameter viewed in cross-section at the location of a saddle notch. 3 sets of pencil lines revealed the cutting sequence. Step 1. Score cuts. 2 shallow kerfs marked the outside edges of the saddle, running across the crown of the log. These cuts established the width of the notch and, critically, defined its maximum depth, typically 1/4 to 1/3 of the log's diameter. Once these score lines were cut, they became fixed references for all subsequent work. The purpose of scoring was control. By establishing depth limits before excavating the hollow, the builder prevented overcuts that would weaken the joint or create uneven bearing. The score lines also interrupted wood fibers, creating clean edges where the notch would meet undisturbed wood. Step 2. Relief cuts. Between the 2 score lines, additional short kerfs divided the waist area into smaller sections. These relief cuts didn't extend to full depth. They typically reached only halfway to the score line or less. Their purpose was to break the waist into blocks that could be removed easily and to create chip clearance paths that prevented the saw from binding. The relief cuts represented a fundamental insight about sawing. Keeping the kerf shallow and the plate cool preserved tooth sharpness far longer than forcing deep, continuous cuts. In green wood, where moisture and varying grain created unpredictable resistance, shallow cuts were also safer, less likely to bind the plate or kick back unexpectedly. Step 3. Paring cuts. With the waist area scored and relieved, the builder switched from saw to hatchet or light axe. Working along the grain where possible, chopping and splitting removed the waist blocks. The bottom of the saddle was then smoothed to create a defined bearing surface, essentially a flat or gently curved seat where the log above would rest. The cheeks, the vertical faces on either side of the saddle, received special attention in well-cut notches. Instead of being carved parallel and tight, they were paired with a slight outward flare, perhaps 2 to 3 degrees. This flare meant the upper log contacted the bearing seat, but not the cheek faces, except at the very bottom. Under load, the joint compressed predictably onto the seat, rather than crushing randomly against the cheeks. Typical dimensions for a saddle in a 10 to 12-inch log. Seat length 2 to 3 times the log diameter, 20 to 36 inches. Seat width matching the log diameter or slightly less, bearing band on each side 1.5 to 2 inches wide. These proportions distributed weight effectively and allowed for differential settlement without opening large gaps. The geometry was not exotic. It required no special tools beyond what any cabin builder would have: saw, axe, hatchet, perhaps a scribe or marking gauge. What it required was discipline, making 3 separate operations instead of one continuous cut, and understanding that the extra setup time would be repaid in tool life and joint performance. The critical insight was treating the notch as 3 separate problems: establishing limits, removing waste, creating bearing surfaces. Trying to solve all 3 simultaneously with one deep, wandering saw cut asked too much of the tool and produced inconsistent results. Breaking the work into stages made each operation simpler, safer, and more controllable. Later analysis of surviving cabins would show that notches exhibiting this 3-phase pattern, visible in tool marks and geometry, consistently performed better over decades of service than notches cut in single operations, even when both types appeared tight and well fitted at initial construction. The notebook sat on a rough plank table in a ranger cabin, its pages filled with pencil entries tracking work progress through the summer of 1910. One page showed 2 columns labeled Old Way and 3 Cut, with tally marks recording notches completed between saw sharpenings. The Ranger District was building a cabin and a Iosauter small barn that season, approximately 80 saddle notches in total for the cabin, another 40 for the barn. The notebook entries suggested someone was conducting a deliberate comparison between 2 different notching methods, likely trying to determine which approach made better use of limited saw sharpening capacity. The Old Way column showed consistent patterns, clusters of 8 to 12 tally marks, then a note about filing. The mark suggested that with traditional full-depth saddle cutting, the saw required sharpening after every 8 to 12 notches. Over the course of 80 notches, that would mean 8 to 10 complete sharpenings. The 3-cut column showed different intervals, 20 to 30 notches between sharpenings. The same 80-notch cabin would require only 3 to 4 full sharpenings if the 3-phase method were used consistently. The time implications were significant. Crosscut manuals and later filing guides describe the complete sharpening cycle in detail, cleaning the plate, joining all teeth to uniform height, fitting rakers to proper depth, pointing each cutter, and setting the teeth to correct clearance. Done properly by an experienced filer, this process took close to an hour. Done hastily or by someone less skilled, it could take considerably longer and produce inferior results. 8 to 10 sharpenings at 1 hour each, 8 to 10 hours of work that produced no building progress. 3 to 4 sharpenings, 3 to 4 hours. The difference, 5 to 7 hours, represented most of a working day returned to actual construction. The arithmetic became even more compelling when considering that sharpening required specific conditions. The work needed good light, a stable platform, and focused attention. It couldn't be done efficiently at the end of a long day or in poor weather. It effectively consumed prime working hours that could otherwise be spent on the building itself. The cause of the difference lay in how the saw was used. Traditional saddle cutting asked the saw to carve the entire hollow in one continuous operation. The plate had to follow a curved path through varying grain, constantly in contact with wood over the full depth of the cut. This generated heat through friction, and the binding and twisting stressed the teeth and dulled them rapidly. The 3-cut method used the saw differently. Score cuts were straight and shallow, minimal plate contact, minimal heat. Relief cuts were also shallow and short, brief contact periods that allowed the plate to cool between cuts. The bulk of material removal happened with hatchets and axes, which didn't depend on precise tooth geometry and could be resharpened quickly with a file or stone. The saw in the 3-cut method never worked hard. It made quick, clean cuts at controlled depths, then withdrew. The harder work of removing waste and shaping bearing surfaces fell to tools better suited for those tasks. Some rangers and homesteaders, particularly those with lumber camp experience, understood this instinctively. They had seen what happened to saw teeth when plates were forced through deep, binding cuts hour after hour. They knew that protecting the cutting edges meant longer intervals between maintenance and more overall productivity. Others, focused on immediate progress, pushed saws hard and accepted frequent sharpening as the cost of building. In a short season with multiple structures to complete, the difference in approaches could determine which projects got finished and which had to wait until the following year. The notebook entries suggested that at least some rangers were beginning to recognize these trade-offs explicitly and to adopt methods that preserved their most constrained resource: sharp, properly set cutting teeth on their limited number of crosscut saws. The drawing dated to a 1975 relocation and documentation project. Slate Creek Ranger Station's original cabin, built in 1909, had been disassembled log by log, moved to a new site, and reassembled for preservation and interpretation. The process required measuring and photographing every component, creating a detailed record of construction methods and condition. The plan view showed a two-story structure with round log walls and saddle-notched corners. Dimensions matched typical early Forest Service construction: modest footprint, simple rectangular plan, functional rather than ornamental. The elevation drawings showed wall logs stacked to consistent height, with minimal settlement or deformation visible, even after more than 60 years of service. The detailed drawings of corner joints revealed the most significant information. Tool marks visible on the notches showed distinct patterns: shallow scoring cuts defining notch edges, relieved areas between the scores, and finished bearing surfaces that appeared to have been shaped primarily with axes or hatchets rather than sawed to final form. The condition notes were equally telling. While the cabin had required maintenance over its service life, roof replacement, foundation adjustments, interior modifications, the log walls and corner joints remained largely sound. Unlike many cabins of similar age examined in preservation surveys, Slate Creek showed minimal corner settlement, few checks or splits radiating from notch areas, and tight joints that required only minor chinking touch-up. Similar patterns appeared in surveys of other early Forest Service buildings. Alta Ranger Station in Montana, built in 1899, showed comparable corner quality. Several remote patrol cabins scattered across the Bitterroot and Clearwater forests, dating from 1900 through 1920, exhibited the same characteristics: well-defined saddle geometry, evidence of staged cutting, and structural corners that remained serviceable with minimal repair. The contrast with other cabins of similar age was stark. Homestead structures and some early ranger cabins built with traditional one-cut saddles often showed significant corner problems by mid-century. Preservation crews documented cases where entire corner logs had to be replaced, where walls had racked out a plumb, where repeated chinking and daubing had failed to seal joints that kept moving and settling. The difference wasn't timber quality. Surveys showed that well-performing and poorly performing cabins often used the same species: lodgepole pine, Douglas fir, spruce, from similar elevations and aspects. The difference wasn't site conditions or exposure. Cabins standing side by side in the same valley showed widely varying corner performance. The difference consistently appeared in the notch details. Cabins with relieved paired saddles and slight cheek flares performed better over time. Cabins with tight, deeply gouged one-cut saddles showed more problems. The correlation was strong enough that preservation specialists began using notch quality as a predictor of overall structural condition. Tool mark analysis provided additional evidence. In well-preserved cabins, close examination revealed the sequence of cuts: scoring passes with relatively uniform depth and spacing, relief kerfs that stopped short of final depth, and final shaping that showed axe or hatchet work rather than saw marks. The pattern suggested deliberate, staged work rather than continuous excavation. The builders who produced these results left no written instructions describing a three-cut saddle notch method. They simply built using techniques that made sense given their tools, materials, and constraints. But the physical evidence, the cabins themselves, still standing and serviceable a century later, documented their choices and the consequences of those choices more clearly than any manual could have. Forest Service architectural historians noted these patterns in later documentation efforts. Buildings that aged well often showed common features: careful notch work, properly fitted joints, attention to details that might seem minor at construction but proved critical over decades of service. The cabins that lasted weren't necessarily the most elaborate or expensive. They were the ones where small decisions, repeated many times, added up to systematic structural resilience. The measured drawings and condition assessments became part of the archival record, available for study by preservationists, historians, and anyone interested in understanding how frontier-era buildings were actually constructed and why some performed so much better than others over the long term. The photograph from a museum collection showed two objects side by side, a partially finished indigenous canoe blank and a section of hewn log sill from a frontier cabin. Both displayed remarkably similar tool mark patterns, parallel scoring cuts followed by controlled waste removal. The overlap between Old World log building traditions and indigenous timber working methods was rarely documented explicitly in 19th and early 20th century sources, but the physical evidence suggested significant technical common ground. Both traditions emphasized working with wood's grain structure rather than against it, and both used scoring and splitting as primary methods for shaping timber. European saddle notch and dovetail techniques, brought to North America by Scandinavian, German, and Polish immigrants, relied on precise scoring to define joint geometry before waste removal. These traditions had centuries of development behind them, with specialized tools and formal apprenticeship systems that passed knowledge between generations. Indigenous timber work, documented in ethnographic studies and surviving structures, showed equally sophisticated understanding of wood behavior. Canoe construction required removing large volumes of material from cedar or other softwoods while maintaining precise thickness and fair curves. The standard method involved scoring the surface to depth, then burning, scraping, or adzing away the waste between score lines. House posts, plank elements for longhouses, and other structural timbers showed similar approaches. Rather than sawing everything to final form, a slow, labor-intensive process with hand tools, builders used scoring to guide splits and then cleaned up surfaces with adzes, knives, or scrapers. The result was efficient material removal with relatively simple tools. The mechanical principle was identical to the three-phase hewing pattern used in cabin construction. Create guided failure lines. Remove waste in controlled sections. Finish to final dimension. Whether the specific tools were axes and broadaxes or adzes and scrapers, the underlying logic remained constant. Frontier regions where European and indigenous populations interacted became zones of technical exchange, though the historical record rarely captured the details. A careful homesteader or ranger observing indigenous methods for working timber would recognize the efficiency of scoring and splitting. An indigenous craftsperson, seeing European joinery techniques, would recognize familiar principles applied in new contexts. The three-cut saddle notch sat precisely at this intersection. It wasn't purely European. Traditional European notching often relied on continuous cuts rather than staged operations. It wasn't purely indigenous. Saddle notches themselves were a European form. Instead, it represented a practical synthesis, applying the staged cutting logic that appeared in multiple traditions to the specific problem of corner joinery in round log construction. No documentary evidence suggests explicit instruction passing between cultures on this specific technique. But the physical evidence, the tool marks in surviving cabins, the similarity of scoring patterns across different contexts, suggests that builders working in contact zones would naturally arrive at similar solutions when facing similar problems. Forest Service rangers in the early 20th century came from diverse backgrounds. Some had immigrant parents or grandparents who brought Old World building knowledge. Some had worked with indigenous guides or packers and observed their timber working methods. Some had lumber camp experience that emphasized efficient tool use. All of them faced the same challenge: building durable structures with limited tools in remote locations. A ranger who had seen both European joinery and indigenous splitting techniques would be naturally inclined toward a three-phase approach for any critical joint. The logic was self-evident: guide the cut, remove the waste in pieces, finish to final form. Applying that logic to saddle notches wasn't an invention. It was simply recognizing that the same principles worked in yet another context. The result was a method that appeared in practice even when it didn't appear in manuals. Builders who understood efficient timber work used staged cutting for saddles because it made sense, not because anyone had written formal instructions. The cabins that resulted, tight corners, controlled settlement, minimal maintenance needs, provided physical proof that the method worked, regardless of its origins or whether anyone attached a specific name to it. Later generations examining these structures and trying to understand why some performed so much better than others would reconstruct the sequence from tool marks and geometry. The three-cut saddle notch existed as a practical reality before it existed as documented technique, preserved in the work itself rather than in written records. The photograph showed a graduated measuring rod propped against a log cabin wall, with snow banked nearly to the windowsill. The marker indicated 4 feet of accumulation, and the notation on the back read, January 1917, Bitterroot Valley. Winter in the northern Rockies imposed severe tests on building structures. Snow loads, freeze-thaw cycles, and sustained cold stressed every joint and fastening. Cabins that appeared solid during construction might reveal hidden weaknesses after their first hard winter, or their 5th, or their 20th, as cumulative stress found and exploited any flaw in the original work. The structural mechanics of saddle-notched corners under snow load were straightforward. Roof weight transferred through the wall logs to the corners, where each notch joint had to compress and distribute the force to the log below. Well-cut saddles acted like bearing surfaces, tightening under load as the upper log settled onto the defined seat. Poorly cut saddles could fail in several ways. If the bearing surface was poorly defined, just a rough hollow with no clear seat, the load concentrated on whatever high points existed in the joint. These areas crushed first, allowing the upper log to rock and shift. As one section crushed, load redistributed to other points, causing further uneven compression. The result was progressive settlement that opened gaps at corners and racked door and window frames out of square. If the cheeks were cut parallel and tight, moisture could become trapped between the faces. Winter freeze-thaw cycles then worked to split the wood, and the tight fit prevented the joint from tightening under load. Instead, the cheeks acted as wedges, pushing logs apart rather than allowing them to settle into stable compression. The three-cut method addressed both problems through its final geometry. The defined bearing seat concentrated the load on a controlled surface rather than random high points. The slight outward flare of the cheeks, 2 to 3 degrees, meant the upper log contacted the seat but not the cheek faces. Under load, the joint compressed onto the seat, tightening the connection rather than creating splitting forces. Climate records and Forest Service reports documented the severity of some winters. The winter of 1916 to 17 brought exceptional snow to the northern Rockies. Accumulations of 5 to 8 feet were recorded at some ranger stations. Roof loads exceeded anything the structures had experienced in previous years. Maintenance records from the following years showed the consequences. Some cabins required extensive repairs. Corner logs replaced, walls replumbed, roofs reinforced or rebuilt. Other cabins, built of similar timber in the same valleys, came through with minimal problems. The difference consistently traced back to initial construction quality and specifically to corner joint details. A cabin with well-cut saddles might settle an inch or two as joints compressed under snow load, but the settlement would be uniform and predictable. Doors and windows would still operate. The roof would remain supported. Come spring, when snow melted and loads decreased, the joints would remain tight because they had compressed onto stable bearing surfaces. A cabin with poorly cut corners might settle unevenly, with different corners moving different amounts. This differential settlement twisted the entire structure, opening gaps that no amount of chinking could permanently seal. Wind infiltration increased, driving up fuel consumption. Water found ways in during spring thaws, accelerating decay. Within a decade or two, major structural work became necessary. The energy implications were also significant. National Park Service preservation briefs note that air infiltration at log joints is a primary cause of heat loss in log structures. Tight, well-compressed corners reduce infiltration dramatically. In districts where wood or coal had to be freighted long distances, the fuel savings from tight construction could be substantial, measured in cords per winter or tons of coal over a building's service life. Contemporary records rarely quantified these differences explicitly. Rangers noted which cabins were cold or drafty and which stayed comfortable. Maintenance ledgers tracked repairs. Fuel consumption was recorded when budgets required it, but the systematic connection between notch quality and long-term performance emerged only when later preservation specialists examined many structures and looked for patterns. The pattern was clear. Cabins where corners had been cut using staged methods with defined seats and relieved cheeks consistently outperformed cabins with traditional one-cut saddles. The initial extra time, perhaps a few minutes per notch, paid returns in reduced maintenance, lower fuel costs, and extended structural life measured in decades. The builder set down the lightweight chainsaw and picked up a broad hatchet to finish the notch he had just scored. The year was 1978 and the tools were modern, but the sequence was ancient. Score to depth, relieve the waste, pare to final bearing. The introduction of chainsaw technology in the 1940s and 50s transformed many aspects of timber work. What had taken hours with crosscut saws and axes could now be done in minutes with a gasoline-powered chain running at thousands of feet per minute. But the basic problems of saddle notch cutting, managing heat, controlling geometry, producing consistent bearing surfaces, remained. Modern log building manuals and courses, developed from the 1970s onward as handcrafted log homes became popular again, taught saddle notch methods that closely paralleled the three-cut approach. The terminology varied, but the sequence was consistent. Mark the notch carefully, make shallow scoring cuts to establish depth, use relief cuts or plunge cuts to remove waste, then finish with hand tools or light chainsaw passes to create the final bearing surface and cheek geometry. The reasons were identical to those faced by early 20th century rangers. Cutting full-depth hollows with a chainsaw buried the guide bar in wood for extended periods, generating heat that degraded chain sharpness rapidly. The bar nose, the most vulnerable part, took heavy loads when plunged deep into the cut. Dirt, bark grit, and pitch accumulated on the chain, accelerating wear. Chains and bars, while cheaper and more available than they had been in early decades of chainsaw use, remained consumable items. A builder working through a modest cabin might use 1 to 3 chains, if careful with technique. A builder who cut aggressively and let chains dull could consume many more. The arithmetic of tool life still mattered. Sharpening a chain took 15 to 30 minutes with a file guide and proper technique. While faster than dressing a crosscut saw, it still represented time away from actual building. More significantly, chain sharpening required specific tools and knowledge. An improperly sharpened chain cut poorly and could be dangerous, binding or kicking back unpredictably. Contemporary log building instructors emphasized the same principles that had governed hand tool work. Keep cutting edges sharp. Don't force tools through difficult cuts. Use the right tool for each task. Chainsaws excelled at straight cuts and controlled curves. For heavy waste removal where precise bearing surfaces didn't matter, they were ideal. For final shaping of bearing seats and cheeks, hand tools, hatchets, axes, slicks, even draw knives often produced better results with less tool wear. The three-phase logic translated directly. Score with the chainsaw, making shallow passes that established notch edges and depth. Relieve with plunge cuts or additional scoring that broke waste into removable blocks. Pare with hand tools, creating the defined bearing seat and properly flared cheeks that would allow the joint to compress predictably under load. Builders who followed this sequence reported significantly longer chain life. Where aggressive full-depth chainsaw carving might dull a chain in a dozen notches, a conservative scoring and hand-finishing approach could stretch effective chain life to 30 or 40 notches. The spare chains in the toolbox remained unused, available as backup but not needed for the current project. Safety considerations also favored the staged approach. Shallow scoring cuts were predictable and controlled. Deep plunge cuts, especially in unseasoned wood with unpredictable grain, carried higher risk of binding and kickback. Finishing with hand tools eliminated the risk entirely for the final shaping operations. The continuity was remarkable. A mountain man in 1880 with one crosscut saw and a hatchet, and a hobby builder in 1980 with a chainsaw kit were rewarded by the same three moves: score, relieve, pare. The tools changed, but the underlying logic, guide the cut, remove waste efficiently, finish to proper geometry, remained constant because it was driven by wood behavior and joint mechanics, not by tool technology. Modern log building conferences and workshops, when they analyzed why some builders produced notches that settled well and others struggled with corner problems, consistently found that technique mattered more than tool choice. A skilled builder with hand tools could produce excellent results. An unskilled builder with the latest equipment could produce poor results. The difference lay in understanding the sequence and executing it with discipline. The old Forest Service cabins, still standing in many locations, served as teaching tools. Instructors brought students to examine century-old corners, pointing out the tool marks that revealed how the work had been done and correlating those marks with the joint's long-term performance. The lesson was immediate and visual. These methods worked because they addressed real material behaviors, not because anyone claimed they were traditional or authentic. A chainsaw could cut a saddle notch in 3 minutes of aggressive carving, or in 5 minutes of careful scoring followed by hand finishing. The 2-minute difference at each notch seemed trivial. Multiplied across 80 notches, it totaled less than 3 hours. But the difference in chain life, tool maintenance, and joint quality could affect the entire project's success and the building's performance over decades. The postcard showed a weathered log cabin against a mountain backdrop, captioned, "Rough Frontier Shelter, built in days, abandoned in months." The preservation drawing beside it showed the same structure: measured dimensions, detailed corner joints, notation of hewn faces, and precisely fitted notches. The building had been in continuous use for 70 years before documentation. The popular image of frontier cabin construction emphasized speed and roughness. Mythology suggested that settlers threw up crude shelters in a matter of days, using whatever logs were handy and minimal joinery. These structures were portrayed as temporary expedients, barely adequate for survival, discarded as soon as better options became available. The documentary record told a different story. Preservation Brief 26 from the National Park Service, summarizing decades of historic structure surveys, described deliberate construction choices, regional variations in technique, and many examples of log buildings that remained structurally sound after a century of service. Forest Service architectural histories documented early ranger cabins that served their original function for 30 to 50 years, then continued in service as storage, bunkhouses, or seasonal housing for decades more. Many were eventually relocated and preserved, not because they were culturally significant examples of architecture, but simply because the log shells were still solid enough to be worth moving and maintaining. Tool inventories from frontier-era procurement records showed more than just axes and saws. Broad axes, adzes, augers, draw knives, specialized chisels. These appeared regularly in equipment lists for ranger districts, homesteads, and timber operations. The presence of finished tools implied that builders planned to do finish work, not just rough assembly. Condition surveys revealed the physical evidence most clearly. When preservation crews examined century-old cabins, they found tool marks that told detailed stories about construction sequences. Scoring patterns, hewn surfaces, carefully fitted joints. These didn't appear in structures that had been thrown up casually. They appeared in buildings that had been planned and executed with attention to detail. The three-cut saddle notch, whether called that or simply practiced without name, served as a lens for understanding this gap between myth and reality. Traditional accounts suggested frontier builders simply hacked notches into logs, caring only about getting a roof overhead quickly. Measured evidence showed something different. When notches displayed the characteristic pattern, scoring cuts defining edges, relieved waste areas, paired bearing surfaces with controlled geometry, they revealed deliberate work. The builder had understood that the joint needed to perform specific functions: distribute load, allow controlled settlement, resist moisture infiltration, maintain alignment over decades of seasonal movement. This wasn't romantic craft for its own sake. It was practical engineering applied to specific problems with limited resources. The ranger or homesteader who cut notches in 3 phases did so because that method protected scarce tools, produced predictable results, and created corners that would hold up under the building's expected service conditions. Forest Service histories noted that some early cabins required continuous maintenance and were eventually abandoned as too costly to keep up. Others required only routine work, roof replacement, chinking touch-up, foundation adjustment, and remained viable essentially indefinitely as long as someone maintained them. The difference correlated strongly with initial construction quality. The myth of rough, careless building persisted partly because the structures that failed were more visible. A cabin that collapsed after 20 years or that was abandoned as uninhabitable after a few hard winters reinforced the stereotype. A cabin that quietly served its function for 70 years without major problems attracted less attention and fit poorly into narratives about harsh frontier conditions. Preservation specialists working to identify which historic structures were worth saving learned to look past surface weathering and focus on structural fundamentals. A cabin with failed chinking and weathered siding might still be sound if the log walls and corners remained intact. A cabin that looked superficially better might be fundamentally compromised if corner joints had failed and walls had racked out a plumb. The assessment criteria came to include specific notch details. Was there defined bearing geometry? Did the joint show evidence of controlled cutting rather than rough excavation? Were cheeks properly flared rather than parallel and tight? These questions, arcane as they seemed, predicted whether a structure could be stabilized and preserved or would require extensive reconstruction. The recognition that some frontier builders were skilled field engineers rather than desperate homesteaders throwing up temporary shelters didn't diminish the difficulty of their circumstances. Building in remote locations with limited tools and materials remained challenging regardless of skill level. But it did correct the historical record and offered a more accurate picture of how knowledge, craft, and practical problem-solving enabled survival and settlement. The modern log-building community, when it studied historic structures, found inspiration not in mythologized roughness, but in documented competence. The builders who produced cabins that lasted a century with minimal major repairs had solved real problems effectively. Understanding how they did it, what choices they made, what sequences they followed, what principles guided their work, provided lessons that remained applicable. The tourist photograph and the measured drawing, placed side by side, illustrated the distance between perception and reality. The rough, romantic image attracted visitors and sold postcards. The technical documentation revealed a different kind of story, one of practical intelligence, limited resources used carefully, and small decisions repeated many times that added up to structures that outlasted the circumstances of their construction by many decades. The ledger entry dated to 1947, 38 years after initial construction. The ranger completing the inspection had noted roof condition, foundation settling, interior fixtures, and wood condition. Under major repairs needed, he had written, none. Log walls sound, corners tight, standard maintenance only. The long-term payoff from careful notch cutting became visible only across decades. At completion, a cabin built with 3-cut saddles looked nearly identical to one built with traditional one-cut methods. Both appeared solid, both had tight joints, both seemed equally capable of providing shelter. The differences emerged slowly through cycles of loading and unloading, wetting and drying, freezing and thawing. Maintenance costs accumulated differently. Cabins with poorly detailed corners required repeated chinking work. Each spring, after winter settlement and movement, gaps opened that needed filling. The process required materials, clay, mortar, oakum, later commercial chinking compounds, and labor. Over 30 years, a cabin might need corner rechinking 6 to 10 times. Each session took hours or days depending on building size and accessibility. Corner log replacement represented a much larger expense. When a saddle joint failed completely, the wood crushed, split, or decayed to the point where the joint no longer held, the affected log had to be removed and replaced. This required jacking the wall to take weight off the damaged log, cutting it out without disturbing adjacent logs, shaping a new replacement piece, and fitting it into place. The work was skilled, time-consuming, and risky to the surrounding structure. Forest Service preservation manuals documented the replacement process because it was common enough to need standardized procedures. Photographs showed jacks, shoring, and partially disassembled corners. The manuals emphasized care because replacing one log could trigger settlement and problems in adjacent areas if done incorrectly. Cabins with well-cut corners rarely needed such work. The joints might require minor adjustment, shimming a settled area, replacing a section of decayed chinking, but the fundamental structure remained sound. The bearing surfaces continued doing their job, distributing loads and maintaining alignment. The energy costs, while harder to quantify precisely, were significant. Preservation briefs and energy efficiency. Studies of historic buildings consistently identified air infiltration at corners as a major heat loss mechanism in log structures. Cold air entering at corner joints forced higher fuel consumption to maintain interior temperature. In a ranger district, fuel might be cut locally or might be coal-freighted in by pack train or wagon. Either way, it represented real cost, in labor, in dollars, in logistics. A cabin that stayed tight and required less fuel to heat provided ongoing savings season after season. Over decades, the accumulated difference could amount to dozens of cords of wood or tons of coal. Comfort and usability also mattered, though they were documented less formally. A drafty cabin with doors that stuck and windows that wouldn't close properly was unpleasant to live or work in. Rangers assigned to such structures complained, and turnover increased. Buildings that maintained their integrity provided better working conditions and remained in preferred use. The 3-cut method's advantages thus compounded over time. The initial investment, perhaps an extra 5 to 10 minutes per notch at construction, saved filing time in the first season, then continued saving maintenance effort, fuel, and repair costs in every subsequent year. Measured as a return on time invested, few construction details offered comparable payoffs. The challenge for historians attempting to document these patterns was that the savings were dispersed and often unrecorded. A ranger didn't note in his logbook, "Cabins stayed warm today because corners were cut properly 40 years ago." Maintenance ledgers recorded work done, not work avoided. The clearest evidence came from comparing buildings, those needing frequent corner work versus those requiring minimal attention, with the difference traceable to initial construction details. Contemporary preservation economics made the pattern more visible. As agencies and preservation organizations assessed which historic structures were worth maintaining, life cycle costs became explicit. A building that needed continuous expensive repairs was a poor investment, A building with sound bones that needed only routine upkeep could be maintained indefinitely at reasonable cost. Log structures with intact, well-functioning corners fell into the second category. Their original builders, working in an era before formal life cycle analysis, had instinctively built for the long term. Whether through training, experience, or simple careful thought, they had recognized that a corner joint needed to perform reliably over many decades and had shaped their work accordingly. The preservation field's recognition of this pattern led to updated guidance for historic structure maintenance. Later editions of technical briefs emphasized corner inspection and repair with detailed instructions on identifying joint problems before they became critical. The guidance drew directly on analysis of original construction methods, documenting what had worked well and what had failed. In this way, knowledge that had passed informally between frontier builders found its way into formal documentation a century later. The physical evidence, the cabins themselves, served as the primary source, with tool marks and joint geometry revealing construction sequences that were rarely, if ever, written down in their own time. A visitor stands at Slate Creek Ranger Station, tracing a finger along the saddle joint where one log rests on another. The wood is weathered gray-brown, the corners worn smooth by decades of handling, but the joint itself remains tight. A faint step is visible where the bearing surface meets the log body, evidence of the controlled geometry that has held this corner square for more than a century. The cabin was built in 1909 from green-blue spruce, cut within sight of where it now stands. The builder, likely Ranger Jolly Boone Robinson himself, working with one or two assistants, faced the standard constraints of early Forest Service construction: limited budget, short building season, tools that couldn't easily be replaced, and the requirement that the structure serve reliably for decades. The building was disassembled and moved in 1975, providing an opportunity to examine every log and joint in detail. Preservation specialists noted the condition of the notches, the presence of tool marks indicating staged cutting, and the relative absence of decay or failure compared to many contemporary structures. The decision to relocate rather than demolish reflected that assessment. The log shell was sound enough to be worth saving. Reassembled on its new foundation, the cabin now serves as an interpretive site. Forest Service historians use it to explain early ranger life, fire management, and wilderness patrol in the decades before roads and radio communication. But the structure also teaches lessons about craft and building technology, though visitors may not consciously recognize them. The corners hold because the bearing surfaces distribute load evenly. The logs have settled, as all green log structures do, but they have settled predictably onto defined seats rather than crushing randomly. The slight outward flare of the cheeks prevents moisture trapping while allowing the joint to tighten under compression. These details, invisible to casual observers, determine whether a log building survives a century or fails after a few decades. Similar preservation projects across the West have documented the same patterns. Cabins and ranger stations from the early 20th century that remain structurally viable almost always show evidence of careful notch work: scored edges, relieved waste areas, paired bearing surfaces. The tool marks reveal methodical staged cutting even when no written record describes the process. The continuity extends to modern work. Log building schools and workshops, when teaching saddle notch techniques, demonstrate sequences that parallel the three-cut method: mark carefully, score to depth, relieve the waste, finish by hand. Students learning these sequences in the 21st century are following the same logic that guided builders in 1909, adapted to contemporary tools but unchanged in fundamental approach. The cause and effect relationship is direct and measurable. Treating the notch as three separate operations, establishing geometry, removing waste, creating bearing surfaces, produces joints that perform reliably under load. Attempting to do everything in one cut produces less consistent results. The difference shows up in tool wear during construction and in structural behavior over decades of service. No single person invented the three-cut saddle notch. It emerged wherever builders understood wood behavior, respected their tools' limitations, and thought carefully about joint mechanics. It appeared in scattered locations across the West, practiced by rangers, homesteaders, and timber workers who may never have communicated with each other, but who arrived at similar solutions when facing similar problems. The method's survival into the present owes less to formal documentation than to the physical evidence. The cabins that lasted became the teachers, their corners demonstrating what worked. Later generations, examining these structures and analyzing why some performed so much better than others, reconstructed the techniques from the buildings themselves. This represents a form of knowledge transmission different from written instruction or formal training. The artifact, the joint, the corner, the cabin, carries the information forward. Anyone with sufficient skill and attention can read the tool marks, measure the geometry, and understand the sequence that produced the result. The visitor's hand rests on the century-old log for a moment before moving on. The guided tour continues to topics more immediately engaging: fire lookouts, pack strings, wilderness management. The corner joint doesn't feature in the narrative. It simply does its job, holding the building square and tight, as it has done since 1909. That quiet functionality represents the ultimate measure of craft quality. The joint doesn't call attention to itself. It requires minimal maintenance. It performs its structural role reliably, year after year, through snow loads and summer heat, freeze-thaw cycles, and seasonal movement. The extra few minutes invested in each notch during a summer's construction have returned value continuously for more than a century and will likely continue doing so for decades more if the building receives basic care. In a region where freighted steel, filing time, and dry fuel were all expensive, the cabins that lasted longest were built by hands that asked each cut to do just one job, and did it in the right order. If you value fact-grounded frontier history and the craft decisions that made these buildings last, consider supporting the YAI channel or sharing this episode with someone who still works in wood and steel.